In our current standard explanations, time is sitting in the background doing a lot of work. When something changes, we say it happens because time passed. When something becomes complex, we assume it was built up over time. When one thing causes another, we imagine a sequence unfolding forwards. Time ends up being treated not just as a coordinate we measure things against, but as the explanation itself. The moment we take seriously the idea that some things resolve immediately rather than being constructed step by step, that assumption about time comes into question. If consciousness, structure, particles, or meaning can appear all at once, then time can't be the thing doing the work we usually assign to it. It stops making sense to say that time is what produces those outcomes. So the question becomes, what is time actually doing? The usual picture is bottom up. Small pieces interact locally, those interactions accumulate, and over time, larger structures emerge. In that story, time is essential. Nothing can exist until the previous steps have happened, sometimes pushed back seemingly without limit. But the model I'm laying out doesn't assume that. It starts with global constraints instead. Rather than things being assembled moment by moment, the system resolves as a whole, not sequentially constructed, immediately resolved. From this perspective, time isn't driving the system forward. It's describing how already resolved states relate to each other when viewed locally. What we experience as a process unfolding may be the way a constrained structure looks from the inside, not actual evidence that it was built piece by piece. This turns out to matter in places where time-based explanations have always seemed strained. Wave-particle duality, for example, often talks as if a particle is behaving like a wave until at some moment in time it suddenly becomes a particle when we measure it. But that framing assumes a temporal process that might not be there. If the system is globally constrained, then the wave and the particle aren't two phases evolving over time. They're two descriptions of the same resolved structure seen under different constraints. Measurement doesn't force something to change over time, it selects a consistent resolution. The same goes for the concept of measurement more generally. Instead of thinking of observation as something that interrupts a process midstream, it might be better to understand as a constraint that determines how the system resolves. Nothing needs to collapse in time. What changes is which description becomes available once the constraints are fixed. Even the idea of a beginning of time starts to look different under this scope. We usually imagine time as starting at some first moment with everything else unfolding afterward. But if time is not the thing doing the explanatory work, then asking what happened before time might be the wrong question. The appearance of a beginning could reflect the boundary of a constrained description, not the start of a process that had to get going. This is not to say that time is fake. It doesn't mean change doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean physics stops working. It means time may not be carrying the explanatory weight we've assumed onto it. If the possible states of a system are globally constrained, then what looks like a temporal sequence could be a projection of something deeper that is not itself unfolding. That is why this model questions time's role directly. If we insist that causation must always move forward step by step, then instantaneous resolution looks impossible. But if causation itself emerges from constraints rather than chains, then time stops being the foundation and becomes a description layer on top. So the question isn't whether time exists. The question is whether time explains the way reality looks, or whether reality explains why time appears the way it does. And that distinction matters because once time stops being the default explanation, a lot of things that seemed paradoxical stop being so strange. Immediate consciousness isn't a problem. Global coherence is not mysterious. We don't need to assume something was slowly built just because we experience it as extended. This model doesn't claim that everything is timeless, or that nothing changes, or that physics should be discarded. The claim here is that explanations shouldn't rely on time doing hidden work. If something resolves, it should be explainable without assuming it had to be assembled, unless that assembly is necessary and observable. At that point, time becomes something we explain instead of something we use to explain everything else. From here on, every domain this model touches will get asked the same question. Is time actually acting as an engine, or are we using it as a placeholder for missing structure? The assumption that time gets default explanatory power is going to get dropped from this point. From here forward, time's ability to explain anything isn't going to be taken for granted.